Hello, I'm Chris Hartwell, and welcome to The Heartbeat, the place where I talk about just a few of the things that make this little guy tick. Today, we're going to be talking about episode 3 of season 2 of HBO's The Leftovers. Join me, won't you? So, per usual, I will be discussing a few of the positives from this week's episode, a few of the negatives, and then kind of wrapping up with what I'm looking forward to next week on The Leftovers. I personally walked away from this episode feeling very satisfied and really enjoying what I saw, but I did feel like this might be the first time, this season anyways, that a lot of avid Leftover fans potentially may walk away feeling a little let down by what they saw. And I feel like that really does come from the fact that we don't have any of our main characters. There's no Nora, there's no Kevin, there's no Jill, the Murphys aren't even in this episode. And I definitely feel like a lot of the viewers that were significantly invested in the Garveys and the Murphys storyline over in Texas could be a little frustrated with this seeming rabbit trail of episode 3. Me, on the other hand, I feel like this perfectly fits in line with everything that's come before, in the same way that we had an entire episode really dedicated to the Murphys, and then we really had an episode dedicated to Kevin and to Nora and to Jill. Now it's time for Laurie and Tom's episode, which I think is great and so needed for those characters because it doesn't undersell them and it allows you to continue to invest in them, and really proves once again that Damon Lindelof really loves that strict point of view type storytelling, which really allows us to invest in the characters and their worries and their fears and their dreams all the more. Also, as Tom Spazzali, one of the show's executive producers, said recently in an interview, when the show keeps moving, you're reminded the whole world experienced this departure. And I really do feel like this episode and the writer's choice to return to Mapleton did exactly that. It brought a depth and a roundedness to this world. And speaking to that roundedness, I felt like that's what this episode was all about. In the first two episodes, we encountered characters like John and Kevin, people who, so to speak, didn't want to reach into the darkness too far, reach into that garbage disposal after that spoon, because if they did that, they may lose themselves in there. They're really more interested in finding comfort and finding stability and finding safety and not pushing things too hard. Whereas in this episode with Laurie and Tom, they are responding in the exact opposite way. Especially Laurie, being a psychologist, is always seeking to dig deeper, to know and understand herself more, and really pushing the envelope. And Tom also is just clamoring for answers, so desperately needing to figure out what happened to me last season? Why did it happen? Is it meaningless? Is it meaningful? And fighting with all his might to get those answers. And it is cool to see Damon Lindelof kind of rhyming with his past work with the characters of Locke and Jack, who had those exact same outlooks on life. Jack Shephard is seeking to get off the island and return to normal life, whereas Locke is not content with that and sometimes has to unearth things as literal as a hatch. Reading another quote from Tom Spazzali, he said, "The writers and I really want things to be interpretive." You'll notice that almost every event in this season can be interpreted many ways. And I think people who respond to that are recognizing that there's some truth about that. And I think the highest praise I can give this episode is it did exactly that. I felt like it forced me to reconsider things like the Guilty Remnant and like Holly Wayne. Elements that I'd pretty much made up my mind on prior to this moment, but was once again being forced to legitimately confront those issues and perhaps see a different side of them. And the way that this episode did that was take me directly into Laurie and directly into Tom's points of view. And it's a situation of, with Laurie specifically, who continues to be played beautifully by Amy Brenneman, by the way, we are realistically shown what it would feel like to walk away from a cult like the Guilty Remnant, someone that in Laurie's eyes had robbed them of her life, had robbed them of her family, and to have anger against them, and to feel you have to do everything in your power to bring people out of that darkness and into a new place, because if she can't get her own life back, at least she can help others reclaim theirs. And one of the plot lines that I really loved and played directly into that feeling was when Laurie's laptop was stolen, and it was just so Damon to me. And what I mean by that is Damon constantly has this beautiful ability to have things play on multiple levels. So when the laptop is stolen, we have the very obvious level of Laurie needs to get that back so that she can complete her book, which then leads us to that great scene where she has to break into the house and actually steal the laptop out of the hands of the child. But then we're also given that level of, this is perfectly representative of Laurie's life, because as she herself said, I can't start over. And then from there, Damon Lindelof rather brilliantly continues to unfold the plot after having her reclaim the laptop, reclaim her life, so to speak, and she's really feeling up, and she's in the car listening to the music. And then things turn, and she sees the Guilty Remnant members and decides to run them over. A shot which in execution is equally brilliant and disturbing. And right there, we're shown that we started this episode out looking at things one way, looking at the Guilty Remnant one way, and then as Laurie's perspective starts to shift, our perspective starts to shift along with it. And in not too long at all, we and Laurie both are starting to ask the question, did I come to the right conclusion about the Guilty Remnant? And that really is one of the greatest strengths of the writing for this specific character. That being that within each of our hearts can be multiple conflicting desires. And with Laurie specifically, what Damon and Tom are presenting is, she has that desire to love her children, to protect your children, to move towards your children. but at the same time, a willingness to put Tom, her son, in harm's way time and again by sending him out into the guilty remnant hives to bring people back. And speaking of Tom, I really enjoyed what they did within this episode. For me, it was a situation of all the characters, it felt like his plotline had been wrapped up and completed the most in the first season. They had taken Christine out of his life, they had taken Holy Wayne out of his life, they had taken the baby out of his life, and it almost felt like a situation of, are they going to neatly wrap up this character and kind of leave it at that? And this episode really proves to the contrary. It was absolutely a situation of all those events from season 1 were absolutely weighing on Tom and absolutely affecting every single decision that he made. And it was really interesting having left a cult, similar to Laurie, but really respond to it differently. Whereas Laurie was fleeing and rejecting that thing wholeheartedly, Tom was continuing to dredge up those past events, needing to find significance and needing to find meaning in those horrifying events from his past. And actually that brings me to the next big compliment for this episode, which is just the show's continuing ability to really own up and be affected by the big wow moments. Whereas lots of shows out there can produce those moments, ones that we the audience didn't see coming, very few can justify it and own up to the consequences of those big wow moments. So for instance, one of the really surprising moments for me in this episode was when the woman that Tom and Laurie rescued from the guilty remnant decided to swerve her car into oncoming traffic and kill herself, her husband, and her child. And it wasn't just put in there to make us gape and stare in disbelief. It was really in there to push the Laurie character to really make the decision that she does with Tom at the end of the episode. And another brilliant thing about the wow moments from The Leftovers specifically is the fact that they allow scenes like the one where Tom is covered in gasoline and Meg is holding a lighter to him to actually feel really dangerous and like something genuinely horrifying could actually happen. And speaking of horrifying, I would be remiss if I didn't at least mention what I'm sure will be the most controversial scene in the whole episode, that being the scene between Megan and Tom. Was the scene too explicit, too graphic? Was it necessary at all? And though each of you will have to make that decision for yourself, I personally found the scene to be very instrumental in communicating what exactly Laurie and Tom were up against. They weren't up against a force that had no drive, that had no motivation. And though we don't currently know Meg's motivation from that action, something that was so extreme, something that did push the envelope so much, you have to believe that there is something within her that is driving her, an actual understood reason, something that she was genuinely holding on to and believing she was accomplishing by doing this thing. Another element that I really loved in this episode was just the visual look. I feel like the second season has that slightly more hopeful tone, and the visuals have kind of opened up accordingly. A little less handheld, a little less close to the face, and I felt like it felt so appropriate to the evolution of the show, and I love that about this episode. Also, just listening to this show is such a treat. There were even some sequences where the excellence of the music and the sound design were actually reminiscent of the Academy Award-winning film Birdman. There was this intense forward drive, but also that kind of ironic hopefulness, where the characters' external situations seem to be improving, but in actuality, underneath it all, things are getting far worse. And how cool was the piano cover of the Pixies song Where's My Mind, which in a fun way tied this episode to last episode. Now, talking about a few of the negatives from this episode, I felt like it was an interesting example of this is what the show would have felt like had they not gone to Jordan, Texas. As much as I enjoyed being back in Mapleton, I did find myself missing the freshness that was brought about by Miracle, Texas. And there definitely was an element of predictability when it came to Tom being captured by the guilty remnant, though the arrival of Meg was rather startling and surprising. And though I definitely enjoyed elements of the publisher scene, what it did for the Laurie character, where it pushed her to, I felt like the scene leading up to that, as far as the dialogue that was in there, did feel a little heavy-handed to me. It felt like it was a little more telling versus showing. Though I was tickled a little bit thinking that Damon Lindelof himself has probably had conversations like this with different executives throughout his career. In a very similar way, though, I loved where the episode ended and what that means to the show going forwards. I just felt like Tom's monologue getting us to that point felt a little bit exposition heavy, like something that I couldn't fully emotionally invest in. Speaking of looking forwards, though, and things that I'm excited about that are going to be coming up here, I absolutely am excited to continue to discover, is Tom for real? Is he actually kind of a Holy Wayne type? Is he really able to heal these people? And I'm really curious to see how he and Laurie's relationship develops, because I could absolutely see each of them coming to that thing from a very different place. I could definitely see Laurie viewing that as something very psychosomatic. Similar to the actress who plays her, Amy Brenneman, who's actually spent quite a bit of time studying Buddhism, I feel like she would say that God is no more than a concept or a prop that help people connect to one another. and I could definitely see Tom actually believing in the reality of that miracle, and that really kind of placing a fissure in their relationship. Also, speaking of Laurie, I'm just excited to see where her and Jill's relationship goes this season. It absolutely feels like her mission and her goal is to reunite with Jill. And not only do I want those two characters to collide, I want the worlds of Mapleton and the worlds of Texas to collide. Also, I'm really just curious to see what's going to happen with Meg. Is she sort of the new Patty in charge of the Guilty Remnant? And where exactly is she going to take that group of people? So to wrap things up, though ultimately I found this episode not to be quite as strong as the first two brilliant episodes from this second season of The Leftovers, I absolutely felt like it was completely in line thematically with this season in a whole and strong in so doing. And that theme being leaving behind despair and moving towards hope. But in so doing, kind of only papering over the past and only just barely fixing things from an external perspective, but internally letting them to rot all the more. So though we do see these moments of heightened honesty and transparency between these characters, and those do seem to be giving them a measure of solace and allowing them to move forwards in some ways, ultimately it seems like that's actually giving them license to hide the even deeper, darker things, whether it be their insanity or decision to follow a certain path, ultimately eroding their souls and leaving them in an even darker place than before. Those are my thoughts anyways on this week's episode of The Leftovers. I would love to know what you guys think though, so please comment below. Let me know what worked for you from this week's episode, let me know what didn't, what were some of the standout moments, what are you looking forward to next week? Also, please do subscribe. I'm going to continue to review The Leftovers week to week on this channel, and I would love for you to stay up to date on that, as well as a few of the films that I've been reviewing here. But, for now, I'm Chris Hartwell. This is The Heartbeat. Thank you for joining me.